Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here today to talk about how we can adjust roles to improve chronic absenteeism. We are Education Elements. We know many of you, it's good to see some familiar faces in the attendee bar. But if you're unfamiliar with us, we believe that schools grow when people grow. We are a national K-12 consulting group. We've been around for about 13 years and we work in 48 states. We've got a team of about 50 consultants and partners, which means that we have a lot of national perspective on how these issues like absenteeism play out in districts and in state departments of ed, but also a large enough team that we can bring kind of the right folks in to solve the challenges that you're facing. If you haven't already checked in with us in the chat, we love a check-in. We love a moment to get present. We would love to know what's your role in district and what's one habit or practice that you started during COVID that you still continue. See a lot of folks adding in your name and where you're coming in from. Thanks for being here. Take a minute and add for us, what's a habit or practice that you started during COVID that you still continue? Drea, while folks are adding, what's something that you started during the pandemic?
Yeah, so prior to the pandemic, I wasn't really big on FaceTime. And now every time I call my family, I FaceTime them and they don't appreciate it during Jeopardy, but otherwise really enjoy it. So that's one thing that stuck from COVID.
I love that. I see Jennifer said, I stopped wearing heels and I haven't put them back on. Love that.
Probably hard pants too. I'm not really into those.
Yeah. During COVID, I started using Instacart. Since the pandemic, I've also had two boys. So I don't know if I'll ever make it back to a grocery store. If folks know how to grocery shop with toddlers and not come home with marshmallows and ice cream, I'd love to know. But until then, it's Instacart for me. Uh,
It looks like Alexis, you deleted her work email from her phone.
I see a lot of digital technology that people started using and they kept up with. Thanks, Jill.
Amazon purchasing. The next question we should ask is, what's the weirdest thing you bought on Amazon?
Well, one thing that many students started during COVID was missing school. And that habit, unfortunately, for many of them has still continued. And so today we want to talk about that. We've chatted with ourselves a little bit, but we'll introduce ourselves here. I'm Courtney Flanders. I'm based in Dallas, Texas, and I work primarily on systems level change, mostly with our large urban school districts, thinking about responsive leadership habits and how we can redesign and reimagine schools.
Everyone, I'm Andrea Getchis and I'm based out of San Diego, California. In my work, I work primarily on strategic planning projects and specifically bringing that methodology to solve more acute challenges like chronic absenteeism, teacher retention, equity and inclusion, and making sure that we're bringing these large-scale implementations across the organization. So excited to be here with you all today.
Before we jump in, we want to just frame the issue that we're here to solve, which is what do we know about student absenteeism? So chronic absenteeism means missing 10% or more of the school year, and this includes both excused and unexcused absences, things like doctor's appointments, anything like that. What we know to be true is that chronic absenteeism rates have risen to about 30% in the 21-2022 school year. This is up more than almost double, from around 16-17% a few years prior to that. And what we think that means is that there's an additional 6.5 million students becoming chronically absent. Recent data shows us that 2 out of every 3 students in the US are in schools with high or extreme rates of chronic absenteeism. So we want to pause for a moment. Feel free to add to the chat, but what does missing 10% or more of the school year cost a student? And what does it mean for those students' peers, those folks who aren't missing that much school? Thanks, Alexis, for adding. Over their career, that means missing an entire year of school, especially if we think about students who start this trend in elementary. I appreciate that, Mackenzie. Inconsistent relationships. Something that sticks out to me is also what that does to the classroom culture and the need for teachers to really be able to personalize and to address tier 1, 2, and 3 instruction in the class. If I'm a teacher and I have some students who historically miss a day of school, a couple days of school every month, I'm constantly having to go back and think about how am I bringing them up and what does that mean for my other students in that same space. So exactly, thanks Jennifer, that lost instruction, even for those who are present because of the need for differentiation and reteaching. Sometimes we look at problems and we think, is this a real issue for me and the state I'm in? And recent data is showing us that in every state that collects data on chronic absenteeism, it's risen in recent years. And these are the states where it's risen the most. So I saw we've got some folks calling in from Michigan, I believe from the State Department. Michigan, you've seen a huge increase in chronic absenteeism, but so have states like New Mexico, Arizona, Alaska, and California. And the problem with absenteeism, just like we've said in the chat, it leads to some other challenges. So not only do we see a correlation between the role of absenteeism and test score decline, but also, and this quote comes from whitehouse.gov, beyond test scores, irregular attendance can be a predictor of high school dropout, which is linked to poor job prospects, diminished health, and increased involvement in the criminal justice system. And we know that, as many of you are saying in the chat, this also carries over into how students' mental well-being is and their sense of belonging. Ultimately, chronic absenteeism is on the rise nationally. This is across all grade bands, especially in high school, but also it's across all demographic groups. And it's impacting our students of low socioeconomic status, our English language learners, and our students of color the most. The negative effects of absenteeism go beyond poor test scores. And the majority of students in the US right now are at schools with a chronic absenteeism problem. We love seeing this engagement in the chat. Please take a moment and just add here, how is your district currently approaching the rise in absenteeism? See things like home visits, having conversations with the families, the students, checking in, incentives to be at school, a focus on relationships and restorative practices, robust site teams to address, seeing correlation between absenteeism and other student needs, like contributing to their individualized attention and SEL, doing some data gathering. Drea, anything I missed that you want to call out?
It seems like folks are working on incentives and relationship building, but that feels, like not quite enough, or that it's still very challenging. So addressing it on an individual level seems to be really difficult as well.
I think one thing we want to say now that we've all agreed, chronic absenteeism is an issue, it's just that there's no one quick fix to solving this challenge. And we see that with any kind of complex issue at hand.
Sounds like a lot of folks are doing work too to understand the root cause. What are the different reasons that this is happening? So I think that'll help inform this conversation as well.
One thing that we like to remind ourselves of, and this comes from our founder, Anthony Kim's book, The New School Rules, is that this quote around how we are designed. So you can read it. I'll read it to anybody who's listening in, but all organizations are perfectly designed to get the results they're now getting. If we want different results, we must change the way we do things. This rise in absenteeism isn't something that we necessarily predicted, but right now we're getting the results that we're getting. So if we want to get some different results, we probably need to think about how do we actually redesign the systems and the structures that we have in place to address this issue. So for any plan to be successful, we want to build off what we know to be true and what research suggests as best to avoid. I will say when I was in the district and working as a high school principal, we relied heavily on truancy core and truancy letters. But so far, research is showing us that punishments, truancy core, initiatives that further disengage students and families from the school community, they actually don't allow people to feel like we're working in partnership, but instead that they're being punished. And so we want to start to avoid that as our go-to method for addressing absenteeism. The second big thing to avoid is adopting a one-size-fits-all approach. Many of you have named in the chat that you're looking at systems to get to root cause analysis, and this is so important. There are deeper trends and geographic nuances affecting attendance in schools and districts. And so thinking about how you can get to the heart of your data and what specifically is affecting your students is going to be important as you work to solve this challenge. And then finally, We can no longer assume that these absenteeism rates are going to change or improve over time. Initially coming back from the pandemic, I think many schools and districts and across the nation, we expected that after a little bit of time, we'd see attendance rates go back to their normal stat. Right now, we're not seeing that. And so it's not enough to say that if we keep doing the things we've always done, we'll get to the place that we want to be. We've got a new challenge, and so we need to redesign how we solve that. So, what are some things that you can try? And for many of you, these might be things that you're already doing. We want to go through a couple of quicker wins and then think about the larger responsive leadership habits. Thinking about this, we like this phrase of belonging, not berating. So, research says that families really want to hear from parents really want to hear from kids' teachers when their child is missing school and what the expectations for attendance are. We also know that in recent years, the root cause of absenteeism really ranges. So some of it might be a health issue, some of it might be mental health or SEL, as Jill mentioned in the chat. Sometimes it's a lack of clarity. We've thought through how important it is to not spread germs during the pandemic. And so some parents are really unclear about when do I send my child to school and when are they sick enough that they need to stay home. And so some of that clarity could be helpful. And then finally, this feeling of disengagement and lack of belonging. For students who started their educational careers staying at home or who have pivoted and spent some time working from home, if you will, there's this feeling of, why do I need to go to school all day, every day? And we're seeing that in the research and direct quotes from students. So what are some things that you can try? Again, none of these are a perfect solution, but definitely we're seeing positive results when we get personalized messages from teachers, whether that's a quick email, using an app to communicate with the student or the family, or sending a call home. Hey, we missed you today. We can't wait to see you tomorrow. Here's what you missed. We're looking forward to seeing you when you come back to school on Friday. As some of you mentioned, districts are turning to incentive programs for attendance. I love this one with the name Attend Dance. Students with great attendance can, go to school events and an additional dance. But that's not enough. There are new reasons why kids are missing school, and so we need to work to reduce those barriers. In some cases, districts are looking towards options like community schools, schools that have other wraparound services as part of them, whether that's laundry services or meals. How can we help students really get to school and feel comfortable and confident being there? In some cases, this means looking at transportation issues and how to readdress busing so that students can be present. And then finally, we really want to make sure that families feel that they belong. So if a truancy letter is about to go out, if it goes out when students hit 5 absences, try sending a message or a note home before that, explaining the issue and offering support, really coming from an emphatic place of, hey, I've noticed you've missed some school. What do you need from us to be present? How can we help you get here? As opposed to it only looking like a punishment. The other big pivot we need to make is really understanding our data and underscoring the nuance. When we look at this trend nationwide, we know that chronic absenteeism is increasing. We've got data on which students are absent, and we know that nationally, high school students are more likely to be chronically absent than in other grade bands. Oftentimes at Elements, when we're faced with a big, complex challenge and we're not quite sure what to do, we ask ourselves to break things into these columns. What do I know? What do I know I don't know yet? And what are my unknown unknowns? We don't fill in that last box, but it's there to symbolize the idea that things will change. I will get new information and I need to be ready to address that. Calling out what I don't yet know allows me to understand, where do I need to get more data? And so some questions to be asking, if you aren't already, are which students specifically are chronically absent in our schools? Why are those students absent? To answer the second question, you likely need additional data, whether that's from focus groups or interviews, surveying families, but getting a better sense of what are the root causes in our district. And then spending some time really thinking about what correlations do we see between our absent, not yet chronically absent students and other school data. Are we seeing some correlations, predictive data around what these students' grades look like, what their extracurricular involvement is? Do we have some school-specific predictors of future absentee concerns that we can get ahead of?
Yeah, and if I can add here, Courtney, I think something about this exercise that's really important is we often make decisions based off of our gut instinct, which is really important to be intuitive. But when we're able to take a step back and say, what do we actually know to be true? What are the facts versus what are the things that we're assuming? It helps us lead with some curiosity as opposed to solving for things. So if I'm assuming that, and I don't think anybody in the chat would agree with this statement, but if I'm assuming that families don't care or they don't see the importance, then I'm going to make a completely different decision for how to solve that challenge. But if I can really take a step back and say, like, what are the facts versus what are the things that I'm assuming, it'll make a really big difference in the conversations that you have at your organization.
Absolutely. I appreciate that call out because when I think about attendance, my gut reaction is to address it in the ways that I've addressed it in the past. Until I really know who's absent, why they're absent, I might be solving for the wrong challenge. So our third pivot is to really thinking about how can you design your plan and not default to what you always do. One of the ways that we often approach work is by thinking through what's our methodology going to be. We don't always have the answer. There's no easy answer to solving chronic absenteeism, but we can align as a district or as a school team on how we want to address it. So we'll walk through a couple of phases of the things that you might take into place. First is to be clear about what is your objective and what outcome are you trying to achieve. Then is some time really spending understanding what are your real and perceived barriers right now? What are the metrics of success that you're going to use and who's going to be involved? As you get into foundations, that's where you need to understand what are those root causes. We talked a little bit about using known and unknown. It's an exercise we'd go through with the team, just like Drea said, to make sure that we're designing for the right problem. That's also when we'd spend some time doing deeper community engagement and understanding what's at play with our student absenteeism practices. Next up, we want to design. So there are many ways to approach challenges. It's important for us to think about what is the right solution for your custom problem and where might you pilot and test some solutions before rolling things out campus or district wide. How can you get some data that lets you know if the plan that you're putting in place is really going to help get you the return on investment that you want? After you've done some piloting and testing, come back, reflect on the fidelity, effectiveness, and impact of the practices that you've implemented, and spend some time really refining your plan, gathering data, updating your plans to be responsive to the data that's in front of you. We lay all this out because it seems obvious when we take the time to step back and say, yes, this is how we would approach the problem. But too often we see school teams have so much on their plate that they just jump into doing the work without being really clear and strategic about how they're going to approach it, how we're going to redesign our system to better solve this problem that we haven't necessarily faced before in this way. And so taking a moment to step back, outlining for yourself, when are you going to do these things? Who's going to be involved? And I would say the next step, putting them on your calendars so that they actually happen. All of that is so important that the plans that you make for attendance actually address the concern that you're seeing. So put that retrospective on your calendars now, because in a couple of months, you need to come back, look at what you've done, and think about whether or not it's really getting you the data results that you need.
Thanks, Courtney. So I think this leads us to the kind of the title of this webinar and the main conversation that we're coming to about roles. So we just kind of outlined a bunch of work that you all have to do. And I don't think anybody on this webinar or in education joined education to track absenteeisms or track attendance. And the reality is that we have a lot of new work and a lot of things that need to happen that don't necessarily correlate to roles or titles that we have within our organization. So to continue the trend of responsiveness, we're going to borrow again from Anthony Kim's book, The New School Rules, and talk about the rule of defining the work before defining the people. So I'll leave this up and you can skim it, but I'll give you a quick overview of what I think is really important here, is that often titles are insufficient for how we can organize our work. So we play a lot of different roles in our lives, and only in work do we really distill it down to a title and limit what we can do within our role to those titles. So something that it doesn't necessarily account for is expertise, the time that you've invested, the ways in which you like to do work. So our job descriptions tend to be fallbacks or crutches, rather than helping us step forward into roles. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how we define that work and then align roles to the work, and then finally determine who the people are. Because I don't know if you all have been in any meetings like I have in my previous roles, where we're all just kind of playing hot potato with the responsibility of, well, that's so and so's role because they have X title, and often responsibilities kind of live in that gray area where everyone thinks it's somebody else's role. So what does that actually mean to define the work before the people? The first is we think of our role as our job title, but roles can actually be fluid, and they're changing so frequently based on the needs of the teams, of the organizations. I actually think that this was something that folks ended up doing during COVID that worked really well, is everybody knew that nobody knew what they were doing. And we were all just doing the best that we could. And we recognized that there wasn't necessarily one person who could solve the problem. So people stepped in different ways and moved in and out of roles. That's something that we want to continue to encourage here as you face the challenge of chronic absenteeism. The next is thinking about the relationship between roles and thinking about people as an essential component and changing the way that work gets done. So how are we thinking about how folks collaborate, how they make decisions together? When do we have to have consensus versus can we defer to somebody in the role that they're playing to make some of those key decisions? And then once we're clear on what work needs to get done, we want to make sure that we have the right people that are fitting that role. So instead of saying, because you're the director of student services, that you should be in charge of absenteeism or attendance, isn't necessarily, it might be the correlation between the roles, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. There might be different ways that folks can contribute to solving this challenge. So Courtney's going to walk us through an example of when she was a principal and how they thought about attendance.
Thanks, Drea. I think what you said about having the right people to do the work is so important. So I was an assistant principal at a at a high school in a large urban school district. And as we kicked off our attendance policies, we did what every other campus in the district did. We had an attendance clerk, and her role was to just track student attendance data to make sure those truancy letters went home. She got the absenteeism notes. As the assistant principal, I was supposed to meet with our chronically absent students and set up attendance for credit plans. But also, as an assistant principal of a high school, I had school culture, any discipline issues, professional development, observation and feedback from my teachers. Attendance was just one part of my role. And then teachers played a couple of roles as well. They might call students when they were absent. They might welcome students back to school when they were there. They might serve on the attendance committee. Ultimately, for me, attendance was always the thing I pushed to the end of my to-do list. I'm not really great with a spreadsheet or kind of keeping track of a binder, and everything with attendance at our school at that time had to be printed out, even though I'm much more of a digital person. And it wasn't the part of my job I really enjoyed. I really like solving problems. I like doing professional development. I like observation and feedback and coaching teachers. And so coming to the attendance was always something that I'd get a ping towards the end of the marking period of, oh, you haven't met with your chronically absent students yet. You need to do that. It wasn't really working for me. A few people are adding to the chat, but just take a minute and think, what roles are currently being leveraged to address chronic absenteeism at your schools? We'd assume for many folks, there are things that are falling onto people's plates that may, as you've seen a rise, become problematic. So it's okay for an attendance clerk to call home if they're calling home to the absent students and it's only taking a portion of their day. But in some schools where chronic absenteeism has risen so much, if part of the attendance clerk's job is to call home, that might mean that their entire day is spent on the phone calling parents, and that might not be the best use of their time. Same thing for teachers. If it's part of their role where they might be connecting with students, but it's not necessarily super clear that that's definitely their responsibility, you might have pockets where that's happening and pockets where it's not. Seeing in the chat, some people have different roles, family liaisons, putting together a team. Let's keep moving on how we would rethink this.
So we talked a bit about things that you might take on at the first half of this conversation. And Courtney just talked about how the roles within her organization divided up some of that work. So this is an example. I think it's symbolic, but also important for you all to do within your organizations is take a step back and without attaching roles or titles, you have to jot down all of the individual things that get done. So whether you do this in a list or you do this on Post-its, putting an individual task on each of those Post-its or on the list are made to show what work really needs to get done in order for us to address this challenge. So you can see here, and please add to the list in the chat, but planning events for attendance incentives or welcoming students when they're absent or when they're coming back from being absent, making a personal connection with those students, tracking data on attendance, analyzing local trends, reduce barriers to attendance based on data, share attendance expectations with families. I'm sure that you all could add many, many more, and I hope you do in the chat. But as you can imagine, this is not the job of one person. This is a lot of different things that need to get done within a school day when the priority is instruction and making sure that students are getting exactly what they need when they need it. This has to happen in parallel with that. And a lot of different people have to play a role in that responsibility. So naming all of the different things that we're going to do to address a challenge will help us then refine who needs to be involved to ensure that it's happening. So please continue to add in the chat any other tasks you think you would add of what we need to do to address chronic absenteeism. So I want to restate one thing. You're adding all of the things to address a challenge. You're not necessarily correlating it to a person. Because what happens next is you start grouping those tasks. You start thinking about how these play together. And then you start adding a role to each of those. So for example, in the first, we have analyzing local trends and in attendance and predictive data, tracking student attendance, and then reducing those barriers. Those are all very data-based, so we will group them together. The next is making a personal connection, welcoming students back, sharing expectations with families. Those are all related to communication and are put together in a group. The last kind of stands on its own, probably because it's a large enough activity and it doesn't really relate to some of the other topics, is planning an event for attendance incentives. So I named the groupings because I think it's important to see how we think about taking the swath of things that need to happen and organizing them and grouping them. You'll notice on the top that we've put names to these that are very specifically related to the topic. So if it's a data pile of activities, it's a database designer. Or if it's communication related, we're having a communication collaborator or a party planner. It really depends on what you all want to do in terms of getting fun or clever or silly with the titles. We really think it's important to name these in a way that is fun and catchy. And the reason that we give names to these groupings is because we want to eliminate title from even being a consideration. It is the person who is in charge of a group of tasks. We think it eliminates ego. It also ensures that our roles can remain fluid. And that is a very clear deciding group or person around certain tasks. So if I know that something needs to be decided related to communication, I'm going to go to the communication or communicative collaborator to make sure that that's getting done.
I love what you said too, Drea, about that these roles help us think of our work as fluid, because like we've seen in the past, when one of these roles needs to be sunsetted or when something needs to be added, we can go to the role and really think about that. So my title as an assistant principal does not necessarily go away, and that is maybe my job. But my role as a database designer might change once I have the data and I've designed systems to reduce barriers based on attendance. Once that's completed, I probably take on a different role. And I wear multiple roles, but I think about this specific thing based on the work that needs to happen.
Yeah, and one last thing I'll add to this too is it really makes you think about the challenges that you have as a project. So these are the roles that are needed to complete this task or to complete this project of addressing attendance or chronic absenteeism. So you might play a different role in a different project, but the goal is to make it very relevant to the task at hand as opposed to the greater responsibilities you have. So I like that you named that too, Courtney, that some of these might make sense for you as a principal or assistant principal, but it doesn't take away from that being a specific task or accountability within a project. And I know you have an example from your school as well.
Yeah. So just once we know what work needs to be done, then we can think about who would we add to it based on their mindsets and based on the work that they are able to do. And so these are not titles. They're thinking about specific people. If I go back to my example, again, my title at this school was as an assistant principal. I actually could do a really good job of looking at local trends, attendance data, predicting, and then thinking about how we could use design thinking to reduce barriers to attendance based on our specific needs. That's something I feel like I would have had the skills to do. Keeping my attendance for credit binder, not so much. When it comes to communication, it's helpful to have one person kind of take on this different role, or for us, it would have been. And I think back to our attendance clerk who got all of the notes and who knew who was absent and who knew why they were absent. I wish that I had given her that task of really making those personal connections, welcoming back families once they're absent, but also sharing expectations with families so that people know, hey, if your kid has a 99 temperature, that's actually okay and they can still be at school. Our threshold for staying home is X. Or, hey, I noticed that you've been making a lot of doctor's appointments. Even when these are excused absences, they add up and contribute to your chronic absenteeism data. Let's try and schedule your doctor's appointments for when we have spring break, or we have a day off coming up. Can you think about scheduling these things then? And then lastly, thinking about this new work of something like incentives, while it's not necessarily in somebody's job description, I can think back to my team and know that I had a teacher who would have really excelled at this, who would have really made it fun for students, and who would have done a great job planning for this kind of event. And unfortunately, we didn't have that. And too often, these types of things fell on a counselor or community liaison, but not necessarily the person with the right mindsets or skills for the task. Again, in all of this, there's no one simple way to combat chronic absenteeism. If there were, we wouldn't see the data that we have in front of us. But what we can do is start to redesign the systems, the structures, and the roles that we have to address the problem in front of us. And so, we'd love for people to just take a minute and think about if you could have some external support to address absenteeism, what roles would you request? Knowing that your team has probably limited capacity, you're probably trying a lot of things. If there was something that you could have taken off of your plate, what role would you want somebody else to do?
This is your time to reach for the stars here, because I think um, you all are the folks who are on the ground seeing exactly what's happening within the schools, and you're realizing, I imagine that there's different limit in capacity. So we want to know what are the things that folks are hoping for, or that you think fall are beyond what your roles currently cover. Yeah, this is tricky. Yeah, folks who go for home visits. That is really hard, because if we're expecting that from, an attendance clerk or teachers, that's a lot of responsibility. Yeah, full-time nurse, social workers.
I think that's a great point from Angela around figuring out the right wraparound services. That is a full-time job and something maybe we haven't had to do before of figuring out how do we get families the right support so that they can get their students to school. And there's so much that goes into that, right? Because you need to understand what specific data or what specific needs are keeping people home. And so it's almost like a whole new job, a whole new role to figure that out and then connect the right services and find a way to communicate that to families and to get them the resources that they need. I'm seeing
Yeah.
for some folks, data collection is really coming up. Like, how can we make sure we have the data we need to address the problems?
Well, and this is interesting too, having somebody as a parent engagement coordinator. I know some people have parent liaisons, but something that's a bit more comprehensive.
Oh, I love that. More evening appointments for families. How can we make that doable? I love that kind of dreaming big thinking. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it really does take a whole community of, collaborating with other systems and industries.
Mhm. We've loved seeing your ideas today. We recognize that solving these kind of complex challenges isn't easy. There's no simple answer we can give you in 40 minutes, but we hope that in thinking about some of the research in front of us, some of what we know works and what doesn't work, and then also how we would approach both building out a project plan for this and rethinking roles, that you got some ideas about things that you can do. Um, so we'd love for you to also add to the chat just so that we can see a little bit of what's an action that you plan to take to address chronic absenteeism. Um, and we're also happy to answer any questions that have come up for folks. You don't have to just add this checkout and hop off. We would love to know if there's any questions that we can answer for you. Feel free to add them to the chat, or I believe if you raise your hand, we can give you permission to come off mute.
Yeah, and while you're formulating questions, I think you might be thinking, I want to partner in this work, and that's what we do. So if you're thinking about ways that you would like support, some of the things that we do are solving the challenges through strategic planning and expanding on some of the exercises that you saw today in the webinar. We are known for really robust community engagement and data collection through our surveys, focus groups, forums, and communities, and have seen a lot of success in getting our community is really behind the initiatives happening within your organization. And then finally, thinking about developing and supporting folks within your organization to work in this more responsive way. One of which is the managing the work before the people. We do responsive leadership practices and restructuring roles that can support with that as well. So just so you all know, some ways that we're here to support you.
Yeah. And even if that's just taking one day with your leadership team to say, let's bring in somebody, let's help them think about our roles, let's help them lay out a plan so that, as Deanna said, this isn't too big for you to tackle, right? It's not too big. It's not outside of your sphere of influence. We just need to design and think strategically about how we approach the challenge. If you think about all of the challenges your schools have addressed over the years, this is one more. It's an additional challenge. It's a new challenge, but it's still something that we can solve for if we design and approach it with a strategic mindset. We've got a couple other webinars that are coming up, most notably, or most urgently, I suppose, is this on initiative overload. Chronic absenteeism obviously is a big initiative that many of you are tackling. If you're feeling like you've got a lot on your plates right now, this webinar will focus on how can you get alignment and results in your district. So feel free to join us a week from today at 11 a.m. Eastern. And then also upcoming, just science of reading, how to bring innovation to your district, and unifying a divided community, some community engagement strategies. The link to register for our March 14th webinar is in the chat, and we will also be sending out that link, these slides, and the workout that we use to plan responsibly today. Dre and I would love to talk with you more. If there are specific things that we can help with, feel free to stay on to chat, or you can send us an email. We would love to help you think through how can you redesign your systems to best approach this challenge. So it's Courtney at elements.com and Andrea at elements.com.
So we'll stay on for a little bit for you all to capture if you want to sign up for the upcoming webinars or if you have any more questions to add in the chat. Thank you all so much for joining us. We know how valuable your time is and how many things you're tackling and balancing. So thanks for joining today.